We're here in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, right here on the National Mall, right across the street from the Capitol building and right in front of the National Monument. There are at least thousands, or there are at least 1,000 or more practitioners of Falun Dafa here. They are petitioning to the government to work to end the persecution of this meditation discipline in China. Falun Dafa is a spiritual discipline rooted in Chinese culture, revolved around the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. Many of these practitioners believe that it's their fundamental human right to practice this here or any country in the world, including China, and that's why they're standing here today. What you see behind me is many practitioners from all over the United States who have traveled here for this very important moment. So it's the 23rd year of the persecution of Falun Dafa. The Chinese Communist Party has cracked down on this since 1999. And one interesting fact that one practitioner of this discipline told me is that they've been coming here to this very lawn every single year since 1999, since the beginning of the persecution. She said on day one, when they found out that the Chinese government was persecuting this discipline, many people who are practicing here in the U.S. rushed here to this lawn to start this annual tradition that they have of raising awareness about this brutal persecution that's still going on today. So right now they're holding a rally here, holding a couple of signs, bringing attention to the forced organ harvesting, bringing attention to the millions of people, the hundreds of millions of people who have quit the Chinese Communist Party because of these practitioners' efforts to tell the truth about this brutal regime's persecution. So right now we're hearing from our introductory speaker, and later on we'll hear some from a couple of Congress members, as well as other people who have been investigating this persecution for many years now.
Communism Memorial Foundation.
Thank you. Thank you for the very kind introduction. And thank you for welcoming me and allowing me to join you again this year on this beautiful afternoon at this important rally. It's so wonderful to see so many people here. As already mentioned, we are marking the 23rd year of persecution of the Falun Gong by the Chinese Communist Party. And sadly, we at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation have worked in partnership with many of you over these years to draw greater awareness and attention to these terrible human rights abuses that are taking place. One of which, of course, is the Chinese Communist Party's most grotesque abuse of forced organ harvesting. Today, Falun Gong practitioners and other religious and ethnic minorities in China are victims of this horrific human rights abuse that is part of a large-scale and lucrative trade. The CCP has claimed that these organs come from voluntary donors, but the mounting evidence proves otherwise. In 2020, the China Tribunal, an independent international people's tribunal, concluded beyond reasonable doubt that in China, forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience has been practiced for a substantial period of time, involving a very substantial number of victims, and forced organ harvesting has been committed for years throughout China on a significant scale, and that Falun Gong practitioners have been one and probably the main source of organ supply, end quote. Last year, a joint issue by 9 UN special rapporteurs called on China to promptly respond to the allegations of organ harvesting and to allow independent monitoring by international human rights mechanisms. Of course, unsurprisingly, China responded to these concerns raised with blatant lies and failed to provide any information requested. Further evidence of this horrific crime has been released just this year by the Victims of Communism's China fellow Matthew Robertson. He published an article in the American Journal of Transplantation, the world's top peer-review transplantation publication, demonstrating conclusively that Chinese doctors are executing patients by extracting their hearts. This shocking report examined many surgical records, including a heart procedure done on a death row prisoner by 8 doctors at Tongji Medical College Hospital in Wuhan. Rather than wait for judicial authorities to execute the prisoner, the doctors themselves carried out the execution by heart extraction. This is one of the many examples that were found that indicate and demonstrate that brain death could not have been properly confirmed and that the removal of the heart was the only cause of death. The leader of China's transplant sector wrote in 2007 that effectively 95% of the organ transplants were from prisoners. This includes those on death row and prisoners of conscience. It is now known that due to CCP policies, highly trained surgeons have for decades been turned into executioners of prisoners on the operating table. In March of last year, Congress introduced an important bill that can help prevent further acts of forced organ harvesting. The Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act expands the U.S. government's powers to directly combat organ harvesting by imposing harsher penalties for purchasing organs, imposing sanctions on individuals and government officials in countries that support organ harvesting, and introducing mandatory reporting on human organ harvesting in foreign countries and on U.S. institutions which train organ transplant surgeons. And it's critically important that U.S. health institutions examine their relationships with Chinese hospitals that we have now documented participated in transplantations where they executed the patient. Our organization is urging Congress to swiftly pass the Forced Organ Harvesting Act and for other governments to follow suit. It is important that other countries and members across the international community break their silence. It is shameful how officials across the international community and the UN remain silent to the gross human rights violations happening across China, particularly those of the Falun Gong. We will continue to condemn China's abuses and demand human rights and justice for all the victims of the Chinese Communist Party, including the practitioners of Falun Gong. In closing, I want to again thank you for your bravery and courage in continuing to stand for this fight, for welcoming me here today, and of course I'd like to invite all of you and those watching us to join us here in Washington, D.C. at the new Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation Museum, located 2 blocks from the White House. So please join us in this important fight to bring justice to the victims of the CCP. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is the Congressman from Ohio's 1st District, Congressman Steve Chabot.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm, as was mentioned, Congressman Steve Chabot, and I'm the ranking member of, and that means the top Republican on the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific. And I'm proud to be here with my good friend Sunny Liu, who's back there under the umbrella, and she's from my district, which is the city of Cincinnati, Ohio, and the surrounding area. And I'm happy to be here with all of you as we demand an end to the horrible persecution of Falun Gong practitioners by the Chinese Communist Party. Wherever one looks, from the PRC's support of Russia during the war in Ukraine, to its unscrupulous mercantilist trade policies, The Chinese Communist Party is challenging the free world and seeking to supplant our values. But perhaps the CCP's most fundamental failure is in the area of human rights. From Hong Kong to Tibet, from the Great Firewall to genocide in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs, the litany of CCP crimes is too long to recount here today. It would just take too long. In light of that, I believe that this gathering is critically important. Here in Congress, back here right up on the Hill, I've been a long-time supporter of the Falun Gong and your right to practice in China or anywhere that you want to, for that matter. It's been 23 years since the CCP began its brutal crackdown. Of course, all those here are aware of how diabolical, how fiendish the Chinese Communist Party's behavior has been towards the Falun Gong and its practitioners. Rape, murder, even involuntary organ harvesting, as was mentioned by the previous speaker. This crackdown, as I said, has gone on for 23 years. And although many of us have been fighting the evil practice of forced organ harvesting for a long time, not enough of the rest of the world is really aware that this crime is even happening, much less its vast scale. But we are gaining momentum. Since I last spoke at this rally a few years back here in Washington, D.C., before probably some of the same people and probably new people as well, especially thanks to the work of the China Tribunal, the CCP's crimes against the Falun Gong have become much better known, fortunately. In my view, Congress should add its considerable weight to exposing these horrible crimes to the world by taking aggressive action. America is finally waking up to the threat posed by China, and we all need to hear your story, understand how brutal the CCP has been to you, and learn from your experience. Forced organ harvesting is one of the most barbaric practices in human history, and it's past time for real accountability. Today, right now, the civilized world must demand that China end this practice once and for all. God bless each and every one of you. God bless your families. God bless the Falun Gong. And God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Commissioner Eric Ueland from the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me here today. I really appreciate it. I'd like to begin with a moment of reflection and remembrance and commemoration in light of the pictures of all the victims of the CCP's oppression in China of the Falun Gong. If we could all take a moment, please, in silence. Thank you all very much. As mentioned, I'm Eric Ueland, one of the 9 commissioners serving on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USIRF. It's my real privilege and deep honor to be with all of you today, and on behalf of our chairman, Nuri Turkel, and our vice chairman, Abe Cooper, and all members of the Commission, I would like to thank the Falun Dafa Association of Washington, D.C., for having all of us here today. we gather together to share in condemning the brutal oppression of the Falun Gong in China. We must never forget that countless Falun Gong practitioners, past and present, unjustly punished at the hands of China's government. Under Xi Jinping's authoritarian rule, religious freedom conditions in China have rapidly deteriorated in the last 13 years. Not since the worst days of the Cultural Revolution have we seen such widespread and terrible persecution of religious communities in China, including the Falun Gong. USURF has repeatedly spotlighted how China's government harasses, detains, imprisons, and tortures Falun Gong practitioners. Victims of this terrible mistreatment have even died at the hands of Chinese officials. This shocks the conscience and should seize our souls. USURF is intently focused on the terrible ongoing reports of forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners. This must be condemned by our government, governments around the world, and all peoples of good conscience. Now, for many years, USURF has been calling out China's abuses and their violations of religious freedom. Since our very first report 22 years ago, just 1 year after this persecution began, USURF has repeatedly asked the State Department to designate China as a country of particular concern. We have urged the U.S. government again and again and again to take real, meaningful actions to hold the Chinese government to account. Now, we have been gratified when the U.S. government has followed USURF's recommendations. They have consistently designated China a country of particular concern for the last 22 years. They have sanctioned Chinese government officials responsible for religious freedom violations, including even one responsible for the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners. And just this year, they implemented a diplomatic boycott of the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. But we also strongly believe that the U.S. government must work together with like-minded partners to expose all of China's religious freedom abuses, impose targeted sanctions for severe religious freedom violations, and propose new ways to stand up together for the right to freedom of religion. So strongly has USURF spoken out against China's abuses of religious freedom that China recently took the extreme step of sanctioning multiple USURF commissioners in retaliation for simply speaking the truth to power. But the USURF has not been scared. We are not running away. We will continue this fight. More can and must be done to combat the Chinese government's terrible abuses, and USURF will always, always, always demand action, insist on change, and drive to the day when Falun Gong practitioners can freely practice their beliefs in China. USURF applauds your courage and your advocacy in defending religious freedom in China. Falun Gong believers and believers of all faiths and traditions must be able to worship freely, safely, and peacefully in China. And working together, all of us will ultimately see a better day in China for all people of faith. So on behalf of USURF and supporting the belief in religious freedom that we all share, with our conscience seized and our purpose strong, I urge all of us in confidence to say, onward, ever onward. Thank you all very much.
Our next speaker is the Vice President of Freedom House, Annie Buyajin.
Good afternoon. Thank you to Congressman Shabbat, to USERF, to the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation for all that you are doing to stand with the people of China and fight for rights in China. It is always an honor to join you for these important rallies, but we shouldn't have to be here. Yet, here we are, once again calling on the Chinese government to end its persecution of Falun Gong practitioners and other religious believers in China. Once again calling on the Chinese government to uphold its own laws and international commitments. As you already heard, under Xi Jinping's leadership, the government has intensified efforts to extend its repression abroad. The Chinese government leads an enormous global propaganda and media influence campaign, attempts to interfere in the exercise of rights around the world, and conducts the most extensive campaign of transnational repression, which is the targeting of critics abroad, of any country in the world. At home, the Chinese government continues to repress and target not only religious believers, but also lawyers, political dissidents, labor leaders, grassroots activists, and even regular internet users. It is, of course, impossible to speak about persecution of religious believers in China without condemning the acts of genocide being perpetrated against the more than 1 million Uyghurs and other religious and ethnic minorities in Xinjiang. But this persecution reaches across communities of faith. In Freedom House's 2017 report on religious revival, repression, and resistance in China, we found that repression has worsened for Uyghur Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, Protestant Christians, and also for Hui Muslims, though what they face is not as severe as the Uyghurs. But over the past 5 years, and especially during the pandemic, in addition to the worsening atrocities committed against Turkic Muslims, communities in other parts of China that seemed to have been facing a slightly more optimistic trajectory, like Catholics and Falun Gong practitioners, have seen that reversed. We are about to mark the 5th anniversary of the disappearance of Gao Zhisheng, a Christian human rights lawyer who was brutally tortured in prison. Videos of Gao Zhisheng being tortured have been used to force other prisoners into falsely confessing crimes. And as we know, for those of us gathered here today, brutal persecution of Falun Gong practitioners also continues. Many may not know that some of the architects of repression in Xinjiang perfected those techniques on Tibetans and Falun Gong practitioners. As we already noted, we are here marking the 23rd anniversary of a major Chinese government crackdown on Falun Gong practitioners, but the brutality continues to this day. Wu Xiuhai, a 59-year-old adherent, has been sentenced to nearly 4 years in prison for sharing a video about Falun Gong with 2 contacts on WeChat. She is currently being held at Fujian Province Women's Prison. More broadly, religious believers and activists on behalf of the rights of ethnic minorities continue to be key targets subject to high-tech surveillance and prosecution for what they write on applications like WeChat. We've covered multiple cases of Tibetans who have been sentenced to prison for writing about issues related to their culture or faith on the app in our China Media Bulletin, which we encourage you to check out. One trend that deserves great attention is the precarious situation for religious freedom in Hong Kong. Following adoption of the national security law 2 years ago, we have seen a wide range of rights related to elections, media freedom, freedom of assembly, due process, and political participation be suppressed in Hong Kong, resulting in dozens of prosecutions. But now and over the coming year, the authorities in Hong Kong and Beijing may be turning their sights on religious communities, especially Catholics and Falun Gong practitioners. The arrest in May of Cardinal Zen in Hong Kong was a watershed moment in that regard. But despite the grim reality faced by religious believers in China and Hong Kong, we are not without hope. Despite tightening controls, millions of religious believers of all faiths defy official restrictions in daily life or engage in some form of direct protest, at times scoring significant victories. Believers have responded to CCP persecution with tenacity, nonviolence, and creativity, and have helped secure the release of detainees. The United States has banned the importation of goods made with forced labor in Xinjiang, but more must be done. Today, we call for the release of all those wrongly detained and for the closure of the prison camps in Xinjiang and elsewhere in China, and we stand in solidarity with the victims of religious persecution. We call on the U.S. government, businesses, and all those listening today to do all they can to stand with the people of China, bring accountability to the officials perpetrating abuses, and stand with all those attempting to defend and uphold rights in China and ultimately end persecution. Thank you for all you are doing. We are with you.
Our next speaker is Sean Nelson, legal counsel for ADF, the Alliance for Defending Freedom International.
Hi there, and thank you all for welcoming here and allowing me to speak. Thank you to Falun Dafa and the absolutely incredible activists and human rights defenders who are here to fight for freedom of religion or belief for everybody. It doesn't matter where you are, it doesn't matter what you practice, it doesn't matter what you believe, but that no matter who you are, you shouldn't be persecuted for your faith. You shouldn't be imprisoned, harassed, tortured, killed, or most shockingly, having your organs harvested. These atrocities have to end. So my name is Sean Nelson. I'm legal counsel for global religious freedom at ADF International. ADF International is an international faith-based legal organization that works to protect and defend fundamental freedoms worldwide. And that includes, and especially includes, religious freedom. Because we know that, as former ambassador at large for international religious freedom, Sam Brownback, said in Hong Kong a few years back, we know that the Chinese Communist Party is engaging in a war against faith. And we know that many of the tactics that they have used against Uyghur Muslims, against Chinese Christians, against other religious groups, those were started, the experiments were begun against the Falun Gong. Every year you have 100 Falun Gong who are persecuted and killed by the Chinese Communist Party. Every year you have thousands who are arrested and interrogated just for practicing their faith, practicing their beliefs, and wanting to live those out freely. It's incredibly heartening to see so many of you out here standing up for the defense of religion and belief, peacefully practiced anywhere, and standing up against the Chinese Communist Party, which wants to make sure that anybody who doesn't see the Communist Party as the center of their life, who practices anything that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't agree with, they want to make sure that you're silenced. And the amount of proof now to show the forced organ harvesting that happens to people like Han Yu's father over a decade ago. The amount of proof is overwhelming and undeniable, and major international institutions and organizations are recognizing it and are joining with you in your fight for freedom. And so one thing that can be done here, right now, over here at the Capitol, at Congress, in front of the Senate right now, is a bill called the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act of 2021. It has wide bipartisan support, and it should be passed by the end of this year to make sure that America stands with anyone who is being persecuted because of their faith or their belief. That's what this country is about. That's what international law protects. That is what all of you are fighting for. And I'm glad to join you in that fight. God bless you all. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Piero Tosi, the Senior Advisor to Congressman Chris Smith.
Well, thank you very much. On behalf of Congressman Chris Smith, I send my well wishes to you. I just came by to show support. I did not expect to speak, but I'm happy to have this opportunity to stand here. You know, for 23 years, you have been persecuted. And the reason is because on that day, 23 years ago, where you showed up to demonstrate and stand up for your human rights, for your rights to freely practice your religion, the Communist Party of China realized that they could not control you. And whatever the Communist Party cannot control, they will seek to destroy. So I commend you for your courage, for your witness, for freedom, for religious freedom, not just for yourselves, but for all those who are oppressed within China. Now, my friend Sean Nelson here mentioned recently a bill that has been introduced in Congress, both on the Senate side and the House side. Senator Cotton on the Senate side and Congressman Chris Smith on the House side. H.R. 1592 is the House version, and it addresses the horrific practice of organ harvesting. It's totally brutal, and sadly, it is you, the Falun Gong, who, because of your clean living and good health, have been targeted by this horrible, horrible practice. Our commission, the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, which is chaired by Chris Smith on the Republican side and Jim McGovern on the Democratic side, we held a hearing. This is one of over 75 hearings that Chris Smith has held on human rights in China. And it went in depth, documented the horrific practice of organ harvesting. It really shocks the conscience, and it is you who first brought this to light. So with that, I just want to encourage you to continue to do what you do. And thank you very much for your witness. Falun Dafa, wan sui, wan sui.
Our next speaker will be Ariel Del Turco, the Assistant Director for the Center for Religious Liberty at the Family Research Council.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be with you today. Today, we are gathered for a united purpose: to speak out against the Chinese Communist Party's horrific persecution of Falun Gong. The Chinese Constitution claims that its citizens enjoy freedom of religious belief. Yet for decades, the CCP has banned the practices of Falun Gong practitioners and wrongly maligned them, though they simply wanted to peacefully practice their beliefs. Those who practice Falun Gong in China are subjected to shocking violence. They are harassed, arrested, beaten, and even killed through the brutal practice of forced organ harvesting. Many of you here today know about these tragedies firsthand. The CCP's oppression of Falun Gong practitioners is unacceptable. Every individual has the right to choose what they believe and to live out their faith, even if that faith is not recognized by the CCP. Religious freedom is a fundamental human right owed to all people. And as a country that wants to participate on the world stage, China has an obligation to respect it. Through its persecution of Falun Gong, as well as Christians, Uyghur Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, and others, the CCP has made clear that it does not respect any individual's right to choose their faith and to live according to the dictates of their conscience. For some, religious freedom is a matter of life and death. It cannot be a feel-good side issue to foreign policy. It must be front and center. The reality is that the Chinese government is not just a competitor of the U.S., it is the biggest threat to human rights in the world today. The U.S. occupies a powerful position in the world, and we ought to rise to that moral calling. Congress can start by passing the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act, introduced in both the House and Senate, and sponsored by Senator Tom Cotton and Representative Chris Smith. This bill would expand the U.S. government's power to combat organ harvesting. We must stand up against the persecution in China, both for the millions who have already suffered and for the millions more who face increasing repression every day. Human rights are inherent. They are granted by God alone, and despite its political strength, the CCP does not have the authority to erase them. We cannot watch these abuses in silence. Today, we demand religious freedom in China for Falun Gong practitioners and all people, and we demand that the CCP be held accountable for its actions. Thank you all for coming today and for being a voice for those who cannot speak up for themselves. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Darren Spink, Associate Research Fellow with the Henry Jackson Society.
Thank you and good afternoon. I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak on this very important topic. And I'm going to try to keep my comments short and sweet on this hot Washington summer day because we have so many other distinguished speakers that are waiting to voice their opinions and provide their recommendations on this as well. I'm just going to briefly discuss first why the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners matters to non-Falun Gong practitioners, and second, what needs to be done by our elected officials to end this horrible persecution. Last month, I attended the International Religious Freedom Summit here in Washington, and I think the most important takeaway for me was religious freedom is for everyone, everywhere, at all times. At this time, I met with some of the organizers for this event, and I heard the horrific stories about the persecution of the practitioners. And I think what's important for non-practitioners to realize, religious freedom is not exclusive to Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and Buddhism. The world has heard about the documented atrocities against the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, and the West took appropriate action. Washington, London, and Brussels have begun to decouple supply chains from this region, and they're holding CCP officials accountable. It is now time that Washington, London, and Brussels investigates reports of genocide against Falun Gong practitioners and take similar action. It is already abundantly apparent that Falun Gong practitioners are targets of mass internment, disappearance, torture, and organ harvesting. There are credible reports to move forward with stronger actions to hold the CCP and officials responsible. The Hudson Institute reported this past January that religious minorities, including Falun Gong practitioners, are subject to medical examinations upon arrest. Results are then imported into a living organ source database. This proves intent for genocide. In June 2021, UN human rights experts expressed alarm that religious minorities, including Falun Gong practitioners, were used as living donors with their hearts, kidneys, livers, and corneas harvested. A May 2022 report in the Wall Street Journal found that doctors in China removed organs from living patients who were not yet declared brain dead. There were reported incidents at 56 PRC hospitals. And despite Freedom House's finding that hundreds of thousands of Falun Gong practitioners were sentenced to labor camps and prison terms, enough still has not occurred. An independent London tribunal has found that crimes against humanity against the Falun Gong and Uyghurs has been proved beyond reasonable doubt. U.S. House and European Parliament have passed resolutions expressing concern over organ harvesting, but I need to stress once again, more must be done. At times, it seems that the U.S. business community has an unquenchable thirst for inexpensive Chinese labor. And it also seems that while the White House seems to want to roll back tariffs, they do not necessarily also always walk the walk on human rights abuses. They just seem to talk the talk on these abuses, seemingly more concerned with gaining China's cooperation on climate rather than decoupling from the CCP. There are reports that the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, for example, has not been adequately enforced, and cooperation with the Customs and Border Patrol, they have not provided enough guidance to U.S. corporations for an adequate decoupling from this region. My recommendations for our policymakers moving forward would, number one, be to limit the National Institute of Health and other U.S. health researcher organizations from cooperating with China until there is a thorough investigation into organ harvesting. Second, in PRC regions where organ harvesting is confirmed, the West must initiate export controls, investment restrictions, and other economic measures to ensure that the U.S. government and the American business community do not contribute to this genocide. And finally, it is time for the administration and the administrations in London and the European Union to name officials, name CCP officials, name medical professionals who are complicit in organ harvesting, and sanction them under the global Magnitsky human rights regime. Thank you again to the organizers for this opportunity. I appreciate it, and I wish you all the best success in fighting back against the actions of the Communist Chinese Party. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Christina Sturgeon, Assistant to the Executive Director of the Jubilee Campaign.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be with you today. I'm here on behalf of Ann Bawalda, the Executive Director of Jubilee Campaign. I currently serve as a law student intern for the nonprofit and her immigration firm. Jubilee campaign promotes the human rights and religious liberty of ethnic and religious minorities around the world. It documents human rights abuses and advocates with consultative status at the United Nations. In March of last year, Jubilee campaign submitted a shadow communication to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. It discussed numerous obstacles that children of minority faith face when they manifest their beliefs. Today, I'll briefly speak on the persecution that Falun Gong practitioner children face in China. It's widely known that one of the most reprehensible human rights atrocities taking place is the forced organ harvesting of living Falun Gong practitioner detainees in China. What often goes unnoticed, though, is the subtle messaging that pervades an environment that therefore provides a path for something as weighty and horrific as organ harvesting. The persecution of the youngest and most innocent is very indicative of the country's mentality and capacity for greater harms. Under CCP political orders, all post-secondary schools across China require students to prove that they've adopted the correct attitude on Falun Gong as a condition of admission. Some school children have been encouraged and sometimes even coerced into slandering Falun Gong at schools and defaming their classmates who are outed as Falun Gong practitioners. If students refuse to do so, they risk being expelled. These attitudes and actions stem from the state's systematic indoctrination of Communist Party ideals to toddlers, which demonizes competing belief systems. As for some specific examples, Vivian started practicing Falun Gong at the age of 13. One night, while sleeping at her boarding school, she was woken up by classmates hitting her and telling her that she was insane for proudly practicing Falun Gong. These classmates attempted to persuade her to commit suicide by jumping out of her bedroom window. A 13-year-old was arrested for distributing information about Falun Gong at school. The police beat her and sent her to a brainwashing center where she was interrogated. This middle schooler started a hunger strike in protest, so the police force-fed her for 2 weeks. She wasn't allowed to go back to school. In addition, many children end up being left unattended and sometimes homeless because their Falun Gong practitioner parents are arrested, detained, or even killed. One girl, Yisha, described the terror she felt at the onset of the persecution of Falun Gong. Throughout her childhood, Yisha continually feared that her mom would be arrested. So anytime her mom didn't return home from work on time, she'd look out the window and cry, fearing the worst case scenario. Eventually, her nightmare did come true. China's persecution of Falun Gong since 1999 aims to get ideological control of the masses. The government equates pro-atheism with pro-communism and therefore pro-China. China's constitution in Article 36 states in part, citizens of the People's Republic of China enjoy freedom of religious belief. No state organ, public organization, or individual may compel citizens to believe in or not to believe in any religion, nor may they discriminate against citizens who believe in or do not believe in any religion. Clearly, that platitude doesn't align with reality. Although China ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1992, it has continuously violated 4 key provisions within it pertaining to the nexus of religion and children. Article 2 says the state is supposed to ensure children are protected against discrimination or punishment because of their opinions or those of their parents and families. Article 13 says that the child shall have the right to freedom of expression, including seeking and imparting ideas. Article 14 is where state parties are to respect the rights of the child to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, and also respect the rights and duties of the parents to provide direction. Article 30, stating children of ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities shall not be denied the right to enjoy his or her own culture, to profess, and to practice it. All of this matters because a threat to one religious person is a danger to us all. Lives are on the line, and we need to keep speaking out. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your support.
Our next speaker is Liu Na. She is a victim of the persecution of Falun Gong. She's here to tell her story.
Greetings. My name is Liu Na. Today I stay here to call for stopping the persecution of Falun Gong. On the morning of July 11, 2022, my sister Liu Wei and her husband Fu Minhua, who live in China, were kidnapped from home by the police from Harbin Public Security Bureau, Heilongjiang Province, just because they practice Falun Gong. My sister Liu Wei used to be a high school teacher in Harbin. This is the 4th time that my sister has been arrested because for practicing Falun Gong. The first time was in October 1999. She was detained for 2 months. The second time was in December 2000. She was detained for 1 year. The third time was in 2007. She was detained for 1 month and dismissed by the school. The CCP's persecution of Falun Gong is illegal. Those who are responsible for the persecution of my sister and her husband are Wang Guohui, Director of the Public Security of Nangang District, Harbin City; Wen Hongyu, Secretary of the Politics and Law Committee; Zheng Baoming, Director of the Railway Public Security Bureau; Wang Yun, Director of Baojian Road Police Station; Feng Yang, Director of Liaoyuan Police Station; Wang Jiwei, Deputy Director of Liaoyuan Police Station; and Sun Tiesong, Guo Shengrui, and Huang Ao, policeman of Baojian Road Police Station. My sister Liu Wei is only one of hundreds of thousands of Falun Gong practitioners who have been and are being persecuted in China. As a Falun Gong practitioner, I hope the American government and all kind people will help us to stop the persecution and to see all Falun Gong practitioners in China released. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Rong Yi, President of the Tweedan Center.
Greetings, everyone. It's my great honor to be here today, honoring 23 long years of courage in the face of the persecution. First of all, I'm very excited to share with you a great news. At the current rate, in about 2 weeks, the number of Chinese people who quit the CCP will reach 400 million. That's a remarkable step in our 17 years efforts of helping Chinese people realize the evil nature of the CCP and persuade them to quit the CCP. The Quit CCP movement, also called the Trade Down movement, is China's biggest grassroots movement. 400 million Chinese sons and daughters have renounced the CCP. This is a really remarkable step, and it's a milestone that will bring China great changes. A free China is in the making. The CCP came from the West like a ghost haunting a land, has brought to the world a century of disasters. Through deceit and violence, it has deprived the Chinese people of basic human rights and freedom. The ultimate goal of the communism is to destroy the world. Facing the evil persecution over the past 23 years, Falun Gong practitioners have always adhered to their beliefs of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. While fighting against the severe persecution, Falun Gong practitioners in China have suffered from brainwashing, re-education through forced labor, live organ harvesting, torture, and even loss of lives. Those did not stop them from widely spreading non-commentary on the Communist Party and persuade people to quit the CCP. 400 million Chinese people quitting the party is one of the countless miracles in the world created by Falun Gong practitioners in the past 23 years. The CCP is heading for complete disintegration due to the persecution of Falun Gong. CCP endangers the world. More and more people have realized that it's most critical to end the CCP. While the Quit CCP movement focuses on Chinese people, the Global Service Center also initiated the campaign to end the CCP and the Chinese Communist Party in June 2020. So our volunteers from New York and other areas have organized cars and trucks touring around America and the world. And we have traveled like 15 miles from all over the country. So 1,000 volunteers tirelessly share and tell people about the CCP. About 2.4 million people around the world have signed the petition. Now it's more critical. Please allow a critical time for me and for everybody of ours to support the end of the CCP. So let's call for international global efforts to end the CCP and the evil Chinese Communist Party. Thank you very much.
One continuing message that we heard from many of the speakers is calling on Congress to take action. They're pushing for Congress to pass a bill to end forced organ harvesting in China. Now, we heard from Congressman Steve Chabot, who's been one of the Congress members who have spearheaded this effort in Congress, as well as Congressman Chris Smith, who has held, what we heard from the speakers, 75 hearings on China's human rights abuses. So this group is really urging, the group and the speakers are really urging Congress to take action here and to expose these human rights abuses, as well as taking action to end this persecution. Now, that just speaks to perseverance. We heard from somebody over in the crowd just a moment ago who has been working in Congress to get them to pass this bill, and he told me it's taken two sessions of Congress to get movement on that bill. So it just speaks to the level of perseverance and persistence that this group has. And I think that that's one of the things that Falun Dafa practitioners have here. So like I mentioned at the intro, if you missed it, this group has been coming here to this lawn since 1999, on the day that the persecution first started in China. One of the practitioners told me that as soon as they got word that this brutal crackdown started in China, they rushed over here to this lawn right in front of the nation's capital to do the meditation exercises and really just expose that this was happening overseas. So the day is actually pretty hot out here. Just to give you a sense for how it feels, all of these thousands of practitioners from all across the U.S. have been standing out here for over an hour just holding these these signs to really raise awareness, and this just speaks to how dedicated they are to exposing these human rights abuses and exposing the fact that this practice is persecuted in China. Now, after standing out here in the hot sun for so long, they will be headed into a parade straight after this, so the perseverance continues even then. They're going to be carrying these signs down the middle of Washington, D.C. They do this every year to raise awareness and hopefully raise the awareness of bystanders who may not know that this persecution is happening. So in about half an hour, this group will head to that parade, and we will be covering that live for you, so stay tuned.
Hello and welcome to the live coverage of the 2022 End Persecution of Falun Gong Parade in the nation's capital. I'm David Zhang, and I'm so glad to have you all join us today for this coverage. Yesterday marked the 23rd year of the persecution of Falun Gong, or Falun Dafa, which is a spiritual meditation exercise. Today, Falun Gong practitioners gather near Capitol Hill to raise awareness of the ongoing persecution still in China. Now, we'll be taking you through the parade event today, but first, let me introduce you to our distinguished panel with our three guests today. First, let me welcome Levi Browdy, Director of the Falun Dafa Information Center. As well as joining us in studio is Tiffany Meyer, host of NTD's China in Focus. And we have the privilege to welcome Dr. Anders Kaur, who is joining us online as our special China expert. He also is the publisher of the Journal of Political Risk, as well as the principal of Core Analytics. I want to thank you all for joining us today for this discussion. And Levi, let's kind of turn to you first, right? What exactly is Falun Gong, and why is it being persecuted in China?
Sure. So Falun Gong is a Buddhist-based spiritual practice that involves slow-moving exercises, a sitting meditation, but also the studying of the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. It was first made public in China in 1992 and immediately became very, very popular, primarily because of health benefits. So people always started to tell their friends and family because they were getting very, very healthy, chronic illnesses were going away. But pretty soon, actually, people, as they delved more into the teachings of Falun Gong, they realized, actually, this is a fairly profound spiritual practice that really takes back or draws from the traditional culture of China.
Okay, and we have the very good honor to listen to some of the beautiful on-the-ground music from the Tango Marching Band. So let's just bring in our live coverage here on the ground near the National Mall and listen to the Tango Marching Band perform their music. Route today, and let me just put up the map as to where they're heading. Here down Pennsylvania Avenue, and the destination for today's parade will be near the Freedom Plaza, which will be very much near the Washington Monument as well as the White House. And so that's where we're going to continue our coverage, but kind of resume our discussion earlier. Falun Gong is a Buddhist-based spiritual exercise, right? It's being persecuted in China. Why?
So by the end of it was first to understand in 1990, throughout the 1990s, it was extremely popular. In fact, the Chinese government did a survey and found at the end of about 1998, 170 to 100 million people were practicing.
Okay.
So with that many people practicing, some in the Chinese Communist Party leadership grew nervous. There's also the spiritual component. For decades, the Chinese government has tried to instill Marxism and Leninism on the Chinese people, and along comes something that's really heartland traditional Chinese, bringing back some of the great things of traditional Chinese culture. That played a role, but the main reason that the persecution started was the leader of the CCP at the time, a man named Jiang Zemin, was really looking to build up his own power base. He came to power in the wake of the Tiananmen Square massacre, didn't have a lot of credibility around the other people in the leadership, and he saw in Falun Gong what he thought was an easy target to kind of have a cultural revolution to build up his own power base, and he chose Falun Gong, and that's tragically really the main reason the persecution started. Is Jiang Zemin wanted to have a group to sort of paint as evil and mobilize the whole society to build his own cult of personality up. That's really what happened.
Right. So, and we'll definitely go over what exactly is that cult of personality with our two other experts that are covering China. But first, the idea is that why should the American people care so much about something that's from China?
I think it comes down to three things. First, the persecution of Falun Gong is really the canary in the coal mine for 21st century tyranny. It came at a time when the internet was rising, when China was rising, and the methods that the CCP used to persecute Falun Gong we now see being dealt on other groups, other regions, and even impacting us in the West. So this is really important. It's like an incubator for persecution that we're all starting to feel from the CCP. That's the first reason. The second reason is the Falun Gong, out of the Falun Gong community, both inside China and outside China, became voices and activism and organizations that really became the largest whistleblower of the CCP's crimes on the world stage. And so that's been very helpful for the world community because it's helped us understand the nature of the threat. I think the third reason is something that speaks to our humanity, and that is we're talking about people who believe in truthfulness, compassion, forbearance, and they're being persecuted for that. And if we as a world community can't stand up and say something about that, something's really, really wrong. So I think those are the main three reasons, I'd say.
Now, of course, if you're just joining us right now, this is the live coverage of the parade to call for the end of persecution of Falun Gong in China. And as we can see here, leading the way is a large banner that says Falun Dafa is great. Now, throughout the parade today, you're going to see all kinds of different banners. Some of them will be in English, and some of them will be in Mandarin Chinese, so I'll break that down for you as well. Tiffany, let me turn to you now with kind of the question maybe many people would have, which is, what was the relationship between Falun Gong and the Chinese government?
Well, so to begin, kind of, Levi covered that a little bit, right? When it first started in, say, 1992, it was very popular. And actually, at the time, there was kind of this Qigong craze happening in China. So there's a lot of excitement and involvement in this. So even the Chinese regime and state media was promoting this, because as Levi mentioned, there's a lot of health benefits to it. And then as he also mentioned, right, it became really popular. So a lot of Chinese Communist Party officials were also practicing this, right? A lot of people wanted to become healthier, but they also really liked the moral component to it. But with the Chinese regime, right, they're atheist to begin with, and so they can't stand anything that threatens their thing. They can't have anything that's a higher authority than them. And so based on the Marxist-Leninism, there's a lot of struggle involved. And so Jiang Zemin, as Levi mentioned, wanted to build his own power base. And so he saw this massive amount of people that had more numbers than were in the Chinese Communist Party, and he saw that as a threat to his power and his party. And so basically overnight, on 7/20 in 1999, they just started this overnight campaign where all the state media, every state organ, everything like schools, companies, just cracked down. We're like, you can't do this. And so no one had ever seen that. It's like if you're just doing yoga, right, for your own benefit, and then suddenly it's illegal.
So that's interesting because China is the only place or a country that you cannot practice Falun Gong legally, right? Seems like everywhere else in the world you can. Why is that?
Well, so it kind of goes back to the Chinese regime's build and stuff. So anything the Chinese regime can't control, they're like, either we have to change it so that they agree with us, or we have to destroy it. So that's what you see with Falun Gong especially, because you can't control hearts, right? You can't control what people believe. They try. I mean, after the Tiananmen Square massacre, they realized, oh, they could kind of silence students quite easily. But they realized with Falun Gong, they thought it'd be like a 3-day thing. They could just wipe them all out, silence them, but that didn't quite play out.
I see. Okay. Dr. Kaur, let me just get this kind of sorted out here. Today is the 20th, or yesterday actually, marked the 23rd year the persecution has been ongoing. Why do you think the persecution hasn't stopped yet? Sorry, I don't think we can hear your sound right now. Let me just quickly, Levi, perhaps we can jump to you and get you to answer this question for now.
I think there's a few reasons. First of all, when they first started the persecution, again, this came from the top, and so there's no impetus or any sort of appetite for stopping it. As the persecution progressed and the level of atrocities, the horrors that were unfolding, they realized this became a cover-up.
Oh,
now they couldn't, they crossed a line where they couldn't go back, they couldn't say, oh, sorry, we were wrong, because so many top-level officials were implicated in such horrible crimes. And I think the last part about why it hasn't stopped is now, as I mentioned, Falun Gong is a leading whistleblower on the world stage, and were they to change their attitude about Falun Gong, Falun Gong would have probably even a bigger voice and calling them out on the crimes that they've committed.
I see. And Dr. Kaur, let me know if you can hear or answer this question here, which is the Chinese regime, it seems with Falun Gong as well as many other religious groups in China, are they waging a war on religion in China?
I do think so. The Chinese regime is not only taking it out against Falun Gong, which I believe is a genocide. The repression, I believe, is a genocide against Falun Gong. But of course, they're using the similar tactics against Uyghurs, and arguably the tactics against the Uyghurs came after the Falun Gong, the genocide against Falun Gong. So they're just moving that genocide, rolling it over to a new religion, and they're using similar tactics against Christians, Taoists. They're knocking down crosses from the churches, Christian churches. Tibetan Buddhists are under attack. So the Chinese Communist Party really is it's a Marxist party, a Marxist-Leninist party. It's against religion. Marx has always thought that religion was the opiate of the masses, and it's always been the Marxists and the communists have always attacked religion.
Thank you. And let's just quickly introduce our next topic with a short video here. And this is for a concept we're going to be discussing, which is called the 610 office, and how exactly that plays into the persecution and what we're going to be talking about today. So I'll have that for you now.
On June 10th, 1999, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party created a group for handling the Falun Gong problem. That group created what came to be known as the 610 office, named for the date of its establishment. Since then, the 610 office has overseen China's nationwide persecution of Falun Gong. The 610 office exists above Chinese law. Despite having no legal mandate, it's been given enormous financial resources. Reuters has compared the 610 office to the Nazi Gestapo, or secret police. The 610 office has deep ties to the Chinese police, labor camps, state-run media, the court system, schools and universities, and even Chinese embassies around the world, directing them to carry out the Communist Party's persecution of Falun Gong. For nearly 23 years, the 610 office has been responsible for the mass surveillance, arrest, detention, and torture of millions of Falun Gong practitioners in China. The United States Congress and other members of the international community have repeatedly demanded that the Chinese government put an end to the 610 office.
And thank you for coming back and joining us for the live coverage of the 2022 End Persecution of Falun Gong Parade in Washington, D.C. Levi, I turn to you now for the video we just watched, which is about the 610 office, right? I've heard terms described as the Chinese version of the Gestapo or the secret police, the SS. Define for us, why is a special task force needed for the particular case of Falun Gong, persecution of Falun Gong?
Well, I think it goes back to what was happening in the 1990s. You know, Falun Gong was a household name, widely popular. So how do you take a group like that and target them when a lot of the security apparatus, the police officers, the police chiefs, some of the intelligence officers themselves are practicing Falun Gong. Their families are practicing Falun Gong. So how do you solve that problem? What Jiang Zemin realized is he needed to create a completely separate apparatus that reported directly to him outside of the constraints of the Chinese government. It's really an extra legal organization so that he could get people that would actually go out and do this. Because again, he's dealing with a populace that at that time understood Falun Gong fairly well and respected it quite a bit.
And Tiffany, is the 610 office still in operation today?
So officially no, but unofficially yes. So basically what happened is it was started on June 10th, 1999, so 610, to deal with this so-called Falun Gong problem, right? But then in 2018, it was officially disbanded. But there's a high-level official that was quoted by Minghui.org, which basically follows Falun Gong people inside China. And so this was overheard, and basically he was saying to other officials that the Falun Gong problem still exists, so the needs of the 610 office are still there. So basically it was merged with something called the Political and Legal Affairs Committee. But the head of that is also the head of the person dealing with the Falun Gong problem. And so basically it has the same function as the 610 office, but without that name. And so as Levi mentioned, it's above the law because they basically know what they're doing is so atrocious, it wouldn't even stand by Politburo law. So they had to create something that wouldn't be held accountable, where they could do all these tortures and like inhumane things.
Right, and the idea of using extra legal groups or organizations isn't something new. And in fact, it seems from my coverage, and Tiffany, I believe you as well, the idea of using some sort of a secret organization to do the dirty work so that the CCP itself can seem like it's not involved in it. Seems like Hong Kong was a prime example of this. So Levi, what were some of the aftermath, if we can call it lessons, but some of the things that they learned through the 610 system that they've utilized now in China to suppress other groups?
Well, it spans the gamut, really. I mean, all the way from, let's start with some of the more base, sort of horrific stuff. In some of the labor camps, one of their goals was, the reason they torture and inflict so much pain on Falun Gong practitioners, they wanted to transform them, right? Get them to abandon their faith and pledge sort of this allegiance to the Communist Party. Well, how do you do that? Torture is not as simple as it is on TV. Right. And they actually refined these methods against Falun Gong, particularly in a labor camp called Masanja. And once they got proficient at it, they would actually have people tour the country and train other labor camps to do that. So that's one example of something that came out of the 610. And of course, as I mentioned, this is now not just a Falun Gong. They're now employing these techniques on Uyghurs and others. I think another thing that came out of 610 is the surveillance aspect. And again, over the last 20 years, technology has changed a lot. 610 and their monitoring and surveilling of Falun Gong has greatly evolved along technological lines, creating databases, tracking movement, and both online and in the real world. And that's another outcome of what 610 has done to Falun Gong.
And let's just take a look on the ground there. We're seeing a large banner in Chinese that says, the world needs truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance, or in Chinese as Zhen Shanren. And that's really the core principle teachings of Falun Gong, if I have that correctly. Today, there's a very interesting concept the FBI has been calling the term transnational repression, right? And what that basically is the fact that another country is able to insert itself into, say, the United States and commit crimes and to suppress its dissidents who happen to have the luck to escape China after the persecution. So, Dr. Kaur, let's kind of talk about this concept, right? This year in January, the director of FBI, Christopher Wray, he outlined this, and China has been a primary sort of actor that does the transnational repression. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the transnational repression is when the Chinese Communist Party would reach out globally and repress activists or lawyers, human rights lawyers, Falun Gong, anyone who the Chinese Communist Party really sees as a threat. And it's often people who used to be Chinese nationals and then they switched their citizenship to a new country, but perhaps the Chinese regime does not recognize that. And they would have their agents in those countries, whether that's Australia, Thailand, the United States, often use physical force against people that the Chinese Communist Party sees as a threat.
How does this apply, Levi, to Falun Gong specifically as it goes here in the United States?
It's evolved. When the persecution first started back in 1999, it was very basic and thuggery-like. We had people whose homes were ransacked several times here in New York and places around the country, certainly around the world. We had people who were assaulted. Several Chinese sort of thugs would beat up people in San Francisco, Chicago, New York, even had someone shot at. So that has started at the very beginning, and it continues to this day. We still have that kind of thing, getting death threats and things of that nature. Obviously, though, it has evolved a lot and is far more multifaceted and sophisticated. And I think it's harder to track specific movements of who's talking to what and who's pulling which levers of power. But you can see it in some of the outcome. For example, the silence of Falun Gong in some of the major media is no accident. And we can sort of track an arc of when it was covered a great deal, what happened, the money, the amount of money that was flowing from the CCP to our media institutions, and come to a conclusion there. And I think similar arc can be seen in some of the political environment, the economic environment. So there's been a lot of effort aimed at marginalizing and silencing Falun Gong here in the United States and really around the world.
And it's very interesting when you look at the situation, because the persecution itself in China, if we look at the comparison to coverages of the human rights abuses, it's relatively throughout the years pretty smaller than some of the other groups that's been covered. Why is that for Falun Gong if the persecution has been going on since 1999?
It's a great question. And I think it's important to first note that in the beginning, those first 2 years, it wasn't like that. I mean, Ian Johnson won the Pulitzer Prize in 2001 for his coverage specifically of Falun Gong, tracking people who were being imprisoned and tortured and things like that. The Washington Post had great coverage back in 2000, really showing that that torture is something that they mandated from the top down. But around 2003, the coverage really fell off a cliff. And I think one of the things you can point to is there was a senior Chinese diplomat that defected in Australia many years ago, Chen Yonglin, and he testified before Congress that in every single diplomatic mission around the world, there's a little department dedicated solely to marginalizing and silencing Falun Gong. And they will use political means, they'll use economic means. So that's the level of focus and energy and resources they've thrown at silencing Falun Gong. And I think when you look at the media coverage, the coverage of human rights groups has been consistent for the last 20 years. Every year they report on this, and then the media coverage has fallen off. And I think you really have to point to that, the amount of focus and resources they've put on, through those diplomatic missions, into our companies, into our leadership, unfortunately.
And if you're just joining us now, the parade is happening where the group will start the parade from near the U.S. Capitol, but they're making their ways down Pennsylvania Avenue towards the Freedom Plaza, which will be the destination. And you're seeing some of the banners here that says Falun Dafa is great, as well as behind that, the blue banner actually says the three characteristics of the Falun Gong practice, or the focus, which is truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. And Tiffany, I want to turn to you here. The audience members that are listening to us, watching us right now, they might be wondering, how is the Chinese Communist Party allowed to continue to harass some of these people, even around the world, but here in the United States? And what does this mean for the persecution still ongoing inside China at the moment?
So for the first part, kind of as Levi mentioned, the Chinese regime really kind of developed a really wide digital surveillance to follow and track these people, and that expands even if you've left the country. If you're now a US citizen, they'll still harass you. If you have any family members in China, there's even cases with universities where students are writing, say, a thesis on democracy, comparing different countries, and their family is targeted. They're not even anyone of faith, just writing about something negative about the regime. It's gotten to the point where a lot of universities blank out the students' names things on their papers. And so that's just like the level that it can reach. And so the Chinese regime's really trying to push this fear abroad. So wherever you are, even if you're not in China, you're going to be afraid to speak up. But inside China, right, that's why it's so important to speak up. Because if you have that outside pressure, then you do see the persecution in China lessening a little. So it's like if you have a big documentary come out or a big film about it, you then sometimes do see those people portrayed in it being released. Like families calling back, they really do find, oh, they have now been released. So it really does make a big difference when it's outside. And I guess the sad thing, right, it's like it's been 23 years and it is still ongoing even to today. And a lot of it is very dark, right, as I'm sure we're going to cover later with.
Yeah, of course. And Dr. Kaur, the question is, how should the United States really respond to this situation?
Well, what's interesting is that the United States is, in a way, responding in the same way that our media is responding, which is a blackout of the information. So the State Department recently released, in the past couple of days, a big human rights report, and I counted Uyghurs were mentioned dozens of times, and Falun Gong wasn't mentioned a single time, which was disappointing. So we really see the same kind of blackout in the U.S. government. What we should be doing, what the U.S. government should be doing, is publicizing the persecution, labeling it, designating it a genocide, which is what we've done for the Uyghurs. And really targeting sanctions not only against individuals and regions as they have for the Uyghurs, but really sanctioning the entire country. I mean, the genocide of the Falun Gong and Uyghurs is being driven from the very top. Xi Jinping is, and the Chinese Communist Party as a whole, are driving these genocides. And so China as a whole should be sanctioned economically.
Just to follow up on that, because the difference between maybe the United States versus, say, Russia or another country is that the sheer size of the economic ties with China itself, right? So when you're talking about getting rid of some of the economic or business benefits of working with China to, let's say, boost up the human rights for defending human rights, how do you see that relationship playing out?
Well, in 2020, we had our institutional investors had $2.3 trillion invested in China, which is a massive sum. We annually do over $600 billion worth of trade, imports and exports with China. And so the amount of money that is being made on Wall Street by our biggest, S&P 500, our biggest corporations, is just massive, and they're all hoping to make more and more money in China. But the reality is that China, as soon as someone starts making a lot of money, they're going to figure out a way to siphon that off for the Chinese regime.
It's very interesting. Tiffany, I would just kind of briefly, I think you and I were having a conversation about the ideas of elite capture, right? So maybe the amount of money that goes to supposedly the foreign investment companies that are in China, how does the CCP use money? Let's kind of talk about that, right? To say, hey, don't talk about us, because the NBA is a prime example of capturing that amount of business, right? But there's certain elites, right? That's why it's called elite capture. Tell us a little bit about that and how this kind of plays into it.
So to begin, as you mentioned, elite capture. So actually, Peter Schweitzer has a book called Red-Handed, and it goes into just the levels of that infiltration. So you have everyone from presidents to congresspeople to business execs, Wall Street, education, literally any sector. And what happens is, a lot of people look at China when it was being entered into the world market, and they're like, look, 1.4 billion people, that's a massive market. They're like, if we just get $1 from every one of them, we're gonna be rich, right? It's not usually how it ends up. But what happens is, to do business in China, you have to have a part that's controlled by the party, actually. And so what happens is they steal your technology, they take everything, and then they can blackmail you. Be like, well, if you want to stay in your country, you have to give us these things. And so then these businesses or anyone is really indebted to them, basically, and has their hands tied and can't do anything. And so then you see that in the US, you have, say, Hunter Biden's dealings with, Ukraine, but also with China. So that affects potentially, you know, our president. You also have, say, Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader, right, in the Republican Party. His wife is related to Costco, the China Ocean Shipping Company, and has a lot of deals there. And in China, everything is dual use. So there's a civil use and a military use. So with Costco, they say, oh, no, we're just building, you know, these container ships, right? But they're also building submarines that could then take down the enemy. And so you have these issues where it's like, well, who are you funding? Right. And then going back to the persecution that we're talking about, the reason they can still be persecuting Falun Gong especially, and also Uyghurs now, is the money that's being poured in. Like, that's not benefiting the people in China. It's all being used to, say, blackmail outside companies, outside people. You mentioned the NBA, right? They're like, we want that market. We're gonna not say anything bad. That was about Hong Kong, right? Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. So it's really used as a silencing thing, and it goes back to just the way the CCP operates, right? The Chinese Communist Party, anything they can't control, they want to wipe out. So anyways, either they make you agree with them or they'll buy you out. They'll just apply whatever pressure they can. So it really is just this top-down approach, as several of us have been mentioning, and that's how they're able to keep operating.
And if you're watching on the ground here, there's actually a banner approaching us that says, "Bring Zhang to justice." And Zhang, Levi, quickly just give us a refresher. What is Zhang, or who is Zhang?
Zhang was the leader of the Communist Party when they launched the persecution of Falun Gong, and was the single figure who made sure it happened. It really comes down to him.
Right, and Levi, I just want to ask if do we know any examples as to either that's the 610 office in China or some type of a transnational repression that particularly happened with Falun Gong practitioners, and if there's anything like that, or if there's any case we should know about the U.S. actually doing something that would stop this, like sanctions or anything like that?
Well, I think that the sanctions are very interesting. Okay. I think because a lot of, essentially what they do is they prevent the person and their immediate family from traveling to China or storing money here. But, and that sounds like maybe a relatively small thing, but it's huge inside China because so many leaders are trying to get them and their families out, get them into schools. And so to prevent someone from coming here is huge. And it was interesting when Secretary Blinken announced the sanction against this last official, Hu Wei. He's actually a 610 official. Oh, and that's very big because for many years the Chinese regime didn't acknowledge that 610 even existed. And the fact that our government would go ahead and target someone like that was a huge blow to China, but also it sent ripple effects throughout China when all the security chiefs and the police chiefs were saying, okay, if this guy could be sanctioned, I better think twice about what I'm doing to Falun Gong in my city.
Very interesting. Before we kind of go on to more us talking, let's kind of take a brief pause and watch a video from some of the politicians who actually send us some of the messages that they want to share with our audience today. We have 3 congressional members, senators and representatives, and delegate actually, who are going to share their message of support, but also message of condemnation for what the Chinese Communist Party is doing to the Falun Gong in China. So we'll play that for you.
The CCP has engaged in persecution against the religious minorities for decades, including the Falun Gong, Christians, Tibetans, and Uyghurs.
I take this moment not only to speak out against the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners, but to remember those who have died for their beliefs. Falun Gong is a peaceful religion that teaches self-improvement through mediation based on slow movements and regimented breathing. Falun Gong practitioners have suffered mercilessly at the hands of the Chinese government for over 2 decades.
Thousands of Falun Gong practitioners have been imprisoned and tortured and murdered by the CCP. But perhaps more unsettling than this unrelenting persecution is that China has been able to commit its atrocities with impunity.
America must remain a beacon of principled courage, recognizing and promoting the basic human rights of all people. If we remain silent in the face of these transgressions, we neglect that moral imperative and do so at the peril of civil society.
In China, Falun Gong practitioners can only exercise their religion under the threat of persecution and death. There's a distinct irony about the propaganda being dispersed by the CCP to characterize Falun Gong as an evil religion, focused on preaching the values of tolerance, compassion, truth, and benevolence. Falun Gong is decidedly not a threat.
The Chinese government's acts of suppression and violence are a reminder for Americans that these rights must not be taken for granted. We must fight to raise awareness of those persecuted in China who cannot raise awareness themselves.
Allowing the Chinese Communist Party to continue this vicious cycle of persecution without consequences is a dereliction of moral duty.
And thank you. If you're just joining us now, we are going to show you exactly where this parade is happening in Washington, D.C. So the start of the parade was near the U.S. Capitol, and they're making their way down Pennsylvania Avenue, and that's going to end them as the destination near the Freedom Plaza area. And then that's where which is near the Washington Monument, as well as the White House. And so that's our parade route today. And to expand on what we've been talking about for the first half an hour is setting up really the reasons or I guess what's been happening in China, right? But there are some extensions or perhaps bigger problems that people are focusing on today. One of them is the forced organ harvesting topic that we're going to discuss. And to start with a topic, really, you know, Falun Gong, how did you guys determine, Levi, that forced organ harvesting was happening even in the first place?
First, it started with witnesses. We had people coming out telling these extraordinary stories that was specifically, I remember one instance, the wife of a doctor saying, my husband is taking out vital organs from people in China who are Falun Gong.
Was she a practitioner herself?
She was not a practitioner, and she was lambasted, by the way. This was a very heroic thing for her to do, because no one ever said this on the world stage before. But right away, a couple of brave investigators, particularly David Kilgore, David Mattis, and eventually also Ethan Gutman, they started investigating this, and one of the things they did is they made phone calls into China to hospitals saying, okay, pretending that they needed a vital organ, and they said, you know, trying to get them to say, okay, do you have Falun Gong, where these organs are coming from? And incredibly, these doctors, in some cases hospital administrators, are openly admitting they have Falun Gong people, and that's where the organs are coming from, and they're just waiting there essentially to be killed. If you need a vital organ, come over next week, we'll schedule the transplantation, which is also the execution. And from there, a floodgate of other evidence came out, but that was really the first pieces of evidence that we stumbled upon that really told us the horror of what was happening.
And Tiffany, Levi just mentioned the idea that the murder itself could be the organ harvesting or the transplant surgery, right? I remember this year there was a research paper published by an Israeli doctor named Dr. Jacob Levy, and then along with him was a researcher named Matt Robinson from the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, right? And in this research paper, tell us a little bit about what exactly was said with regards to the execution that Levi just talked about.
Right, so the document is called Execution by Organ Procurement, Breaching the Dead Donor Rule in China. So in transplant, you have something called a dead donor rule, where you don't take organs until someone is dead and pronounced dead, right? So taking the organs isn't what caused the death. But what happened is in China, usually it doesn't have a history of organ transplants. And then suddenly, basically overnight, they were beating the US. So the US officially is the #1, about I think 30,000 organ transplants, but then in China you would have like 60 to 100,000. So how do you get all of those overnight? And so China was like, oh no, we're using executed prisoners who are on death row, right? But usually these prisoners are not healthy. But these organs that they're getting are very healthy and they're young. So that caused a lot of concern in the medical stage. So they started looking into this, being like, okay, where are these organs coming from? What's happening? How are they healthy? How are they young? How are they basically being taken on demand? And so this study looked at a bunch of reports in China, in publications, they're specifically heart and lung transplants, and they found that usually with that there's a certain process where someone, you know, could be brain dead and then you intubate them and then you take the organ. But what they found in these publications that are in Chinese and was then later translated, Matt Robertson actually knows Chinese, so he could just read them directly. And what happened is there's mention about how the donor died in these publications that they looked at. And so they would cut open the chest, they would look at the heart, it's still beating, and then they would do the surgery. So if they're still, and then they would intubate them afterwards. So that's breaking it. So the study found that these physicians in China and under the CCP were participating in basically executions by organ removal. So they're still alive because that helps lessen the chance of organ failure if you're still alive. And then a lot of the times they just find it a waste of resources and time to give them the proper, say, intubation or anything. And usually with that, it's really hard to get those organs, right? Even if someone did die, say, in a car accident or something, you would have to match them and stuff. But what was happening is people were basically, patients were telling these doctors like, oh, I'm scheduled for a heart transplant. There's unheard of in that field that you would be scheduled for something. He's like, yeah, I'm going to China, and that means that someone is going to be killed for that. Someone's being scheduled to die.
Levi, at this point, it really begs the question, you know, why was Falun Gong practitioners the ones that you guys found were the ones being organ harvested?
It solved two problems at once, or one problem and one major benefit. The first problem was how do you get rid of all these, what were at one point early 2000, hundreds of thousands, soon became over 1 million and even a couple million Falun Gong practitioners being incarcerated. So how do you deal with that? Jiang Zemin's order was to stamp out this practice. How are we going to, you know, how does that mechanism come about? The second was an enormous business opportunity. I think what people have to remember is this is a $1 billion industry. Right. There's a lot of money in extracting organs and organ transplantation. And so they saw in Falun Gong millions of people that they could kill with impunity who are very healthy and make perfect so-called donors for organ transplantation. And those two reasons really drove this, and it was really driven, at least initially, by the Chinese military.
And we actually have the opportunity to hear from one of the victims of the persecution right now. And her name is Tiffany Zhang, and she shared her story today at the rally earlier during this morning. And she spoke with Melina Weiskopf, who is our DC correspondent, and she was on the ground. So we have that video play for you here.
So I'm here with Tiffany Zhang, who is a 25-year-old Falun Dafa practitioner. She's been practicing for many years now. Tiffany just came to the United States just 3 years ago after meeting face-to-face with this brutal persecution in China nearly her whole life. Many of her family members were directly involved in the persecution. Tiffany, can you tell us a little bit about your experience, and thank you for joining us today.
When I was a child, I have started to be afraid of the sound of knocking the door because several times the policemen came to my home and they wanted to arrest my mom, and they also wanted to know where my grandma was. And every time I hear the sound of knocking the door, I was really afraid that the people outside the door were the police. So every time I have to keep quiet and step on the bench and to check whether the people outside the door were the police. So if I make sure that the people outside weren't the police, I dared to open the door.
Yeah, I could only imagine being such during your childhood, always being afraid of who's knocking on the door. That's just something that really stands out and shocks me. You were telling me that your grandmother had to flee home because of the persecution, and your mother was sent to brainwashing centers. And for those of you who aren't familiar, brainwashing centers is a way that the Chinese Communist Party tries to get Falun Dafa practitioners to renounce their faiths. Tiffany, if you could explain to us a little bit about your family story and what they went through.
Yeah, my grandma was also a practitioner. She had to flee for many years because she didn't want to give up the belief for Falun Dafa, and then her pension from her company also stopped for many years until her dies. It means that she didn't have any source of living until her dies. Yes, it's really evil. And for my mom, in 1999, the persecution started. She went to Beijing for the petition for Speak Out for Dafa. but she didn't come back for a while. And then my father also didn't know where she was. So my father took me, helped me, a 2-year-old girl at that time, to find where my mother was. It's really, really, really evil, and I was, yeah, and the whole hardship of my family started from that time. And in 2001, my mother was sent to brainwashing center, and the last time she was persecuted in China was in 2018. Yes, that's my experience. That's my family's experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you and your family. I could only imagine, Tiffany, how just that picture of your father carrying a 2-year-old child to search for her mom because the Communist Party took her away simply for practicing this meditation discipline. Now, I want to ask you, after going through such a hardship as a child and pretty much your whole life, why is it important for you to continue practicing? Why do you hold on to this practice?
Because I have been a practitioner since I was a child, and I think Falun Dafa is really good, and truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance is right. I think as a human being, I should stick to what I think is right. Yes, this is the reason I stick to it.
Thank you so much for your time. And any last words for our audience, maybe sharing your reason about why you want to share this message to our audience today?
Yes, the reason I want to share my story is I'm the 3rd generation in my family to be persecuted in China because we practice Falun Dafa, and I want to use my story to tell more people that how evil the Chinese Communist Party is, and I want to call on more people to join us to stop this very evil persecution. I think the justice will conquer the evil at the end. This is the reason I'm sharing today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for ending on those words of hope, Tiffany. We really appreciate it. And the worst part is, it's not just Tiffany who has experienced this. There are many people like her who grew up in this evil environment, and many who are still facing this persecution today. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you so much.
And thanks again for tuning in. Now we will just take a look on the ground here to see some of the banners as we approach the later half of the parade here. As you can see, this lady here is holding up a "Quit the Chinese Communist Party" sign, and that's a very interesting one. Perhaps we will talk about in a bit. Dr. Kaur, if you're with us here, let's talk about the business of organ harvesting, but specifically the international side of things, right? Tell us a little bit more.
Well, one of the problems, I think, one of the biggest with organ harvesting, beyond the potentially, I mean, I don't know how many people have died from this, but is that it's compromising citizens around the world. So you've got people from England, Israel, Saudi Arabia, who are going to China to get organs, and they should know that these organs are coming from prisoners of conscience, Falun Gong, potentially Uyghurs now. What they're doing is they're taking blood samples from all of these prisoners, especially prisoners of conscience who don't drink or don't smoke for religious reasons, which gives them healthier organs. And so it's a transnational problem, and we've got very few laws around the world. Britain has passed a law against its citizens going abroad, including to China, to get organ transplants where they would be illegal in Britain. The United States is considering such a law, but we haven't passed it yet. So we really need to insist that our government officials take the proper action against this transplant abuse.
And Dr. Kaur, in your book, The Concentration of Power, you actually discuss the ideas, I guess explanations as to the reasons behind why the Chinese Communist Party in particular, this is his book here, would actually go about controlling people. So how exactly does this accumulation of power fit into the concept of controlling religious groups, controlling the Chinese citizens, or now controlling the entire world?
Well, one of the reasons that the Chinese Communist Party, it's so important to pay attention to the Chinese Communist Party no matter where you are, to support Falun Gong no matter where you are, is that the Chinese Communist Party in China, the regime in China, is becoming one of the most powerful organizations in the world. They are incredibly organized. That's what they believe in. They're in lockstep. They try to force their citizens to be in lockstep. There's no dissidents allowed. You don't have a free press. So the Chinese citizens are the government is trying to force them into thinking the way in which the Chinese Communist Party thinks. And China is trying to become hegemonic globally. They're trying to control the world, really. This is a well-recognized fact. There's an academic published in Oxford University Press named Roche Doshi, who's written a book called The Long Game, in which he convincingly argues that the Chinese Communist Party is not just trying to control China, they're trying to control the world.
And what we're watching right now is you have this is a legal parade you're allowed to do here in Washington, D.C., and perhaps you've seen these type of parades taking place across the country, in New York, in Los Angeles, around the United States, and other parts of the world, except in China. Levi, the idea of being able to protest or stand on the street and do this is quite, I guess, impossible in China, right? So let's talk about the ideas of technology, right? Because that's the aspect that really helps them to maintain the control. How exactly has that been evolved, or has been evolving since the persecution started for the Chinese Communist Party?
It's interesting because it not only evolved around the persecution, it was built initially for the persecution.
Okay.
I remember in a trade show, Ethan Gutmann was actually at a trade show in the early years, and he's an investigative journalist that's been following the Falun Gong story for more than 20 years, where there were Western companies actually pitching their services and technology as a way to build up what is now known as the Great Firewall.
I see.
And stop people from reaching information about Falun Gong, and as a way to help surveil and track Falun Gong. So Falun Gong very much became sort of a case study, a subject, an impetus to grow some of the technology, which now today is the Great Firewall, which blocks a lot of the internet for Chinese citizens. There's also an enormous system of, I think at this point, 600 million closed circuit cameras around the country called Skynet. Right. And they use that to surveil and monitor Falun Gong. And of course, it doesn't stop at Falun Gong. It's now the entire Chinese populace.
And just as with the persecution goes, now Uyghurs are another group that's being targeted. Tibetans, right? Muslims, Christians in China as well. Tiffany, what about today? How has the People's Republic of China, or the Chinese Communist Party itself, essentially used technology and censorship to drive it into the ambition around the world, right, to become #1, to surpass the United States? How has that censorship and surveillance aspect contributed to the overall goal here?
Well, to begin briefly, the Chinese regime practices at home first. So as Levi mentioned, on the Falun Gong, they're now expanding out to also the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, but also once they've perfected that, all around the world. So for instance, they had Huawei, the 5G network that they were deploying around the world, honestly. Even here in America, it's since been banned and blackmailed in the US and certain allied countries, but a lot of countries and even most of Africa hasn't. And even in the case of Africa, you have Huawei partnering with SenseTime, which is a video surveillance platform that's been known to target the Uyghur Muslims especially, right? So that issue is brought up. But what happens in Africa is certain countries there also have dictatorship, authoritarian regimes. And so even if people leave their phones at home, say they're going to protest against it, even if they leave their phones at home, because it's doubled and coupled with this video surveillance, they can track them. And so police know where they're going, and they shut down the protest before it can happen. And even in Brazil now, actually, Brazil just signed a new deal with Huawei to create the first 5G smart city there. And smart city is this term, right, where you use all these different technologies, all these sensors, cameras, the social credit system where you pay with like just a picture of your face, basically, even if you have a lot of makeup. So what that means is you're now under their rule. If they think they don't like you, something you say, suddenly you don't have access to your money, you can't board a plane, you can't do all these things. And so ultimately it goes back to the issue of control, right? The Chinese regime wants to control anything that stands up to it. Kind of the funny thing with Marxist societies, they say there is no God, but they set themselves up as God. And so because of that, anything that threatens their authority, they take it down. And so especially inside China, because Falun Gong was so popular, they're like, Falun Gong is the #1 threat that we have to eradicate. And then secondly is the Christians, as you meant, the house Christians, because there's the official Christianity that you can do in China, that you have Xi Jinping on the wall next to Christ. And then there's the house Christians, where they want to read the actual Bible that hasn't been approved and edited by the party. And so ultimately, right, the Chinese regime wants to be the world's hegemon. So through all these ways of controlling their own people, they want to export that around the world and control everyone.
And Dr. Kaur, as we conclude our coverage here today, it's time for some actions, right? And you've been telling us a little bit, but based on what you were telling us, that the Chinese Communist Party's ambition to be the global hegemon, or the #1 organization that has so much power, national power behind it, how do we go about solving the issue of stopping the persecution, or that's just letting people know about it?
Well, I think letting people know about it, which is what Epoch Times, NTD TV does every day, is incredibly important. And hopefully that will make our governments take stronger action. We need economic sanctions against the Chinese Communist Party, against China in general, until it can free itself from the Chinese Communist Party. And that's basically it. We also, unfortunately, China is growing its military at a very fast pace. It's building more naval ships than we build every year. It's putting more tonnage of naval ships, for example. Some of its military capabilities, like hypersonic missiles, nuclear weapons. It's growing these things very, very quickly. And unfortunately, we need defenses against that. We need to increase our military spending. We need to increase our supply chain resilience. We can't be in a position in the future where we rely on China for pharmaceuticals, for example, which we currently do, or any of the strategic goods that we really need. We saw during the pandemic that we were incredibly reliant on China for PPE. And we just can't allow ourselves to do that anymore. We need to essentially decouple economically from China, become resilient, become strong, become self-reliant, until we can force the Chinese Communist Party into leaving China or into improving its human rights.
And today's live coverage, really on the screen, you see a wave of yellow, and that's not a color you usually get to see on Washington streets when we're there. But the color really, I think, when I think of it, it brings a hope, right? But before we can get to hope, I think, Tiffany, you have to get steps of solutions to kind of go about how to change, right? So we know that the ideas is peaceful protest or peaceful resolution, but if you're in the United States, what are you supposed to do, as say for the audience who say, do we talk to a congressman, or how does that step work?
I think, well, that's definitely a big step, a big part of it, right? So awareness, you have to first be aware there is an issue before you can kind of work on the solutions. And yeah, part of the solutions, right? I mean, if you go look at history after the Holocaust, we said never again. But it seems in not just China, but other countries too, a lot is happening again. So how do you stop that? I mean, honestly, yeah, awareness is a big part of it. Because if you look back in the Nuremberg trials, a lot in the Holocaust, they're like, oh, we just did it as we were told. But part of it is, if you know something's happening and you don't speak up, you are complicit. And so some have already said, well, we'll see Nuremberg-like trials for what's happening in China, especially with this organ harvesting. And it's not just those involved, the ones directly doing the transplants, or, the judges who are sentencing these people. It's also the companies in the West, right, who are funding this, turning a blind eye and really being complicit. So yeah, like you mentioned, word of mouth, spreading it to other people, calling up your representatives. There's plenty of petitions, other books out there. But I mean, a lot of this too, you see it in different areas. So the body exhibit, I'm sure a lot of people remember that, right? And it's like questions of where those bodies come from. China didn't become a transplant nation overnight. But now they are regarded as number one when it comes to transplants. Like medical institutions around the world are learning from them. And what does that mean for our medical institutions going forward if we're learning from them and they're killing these innocent people on demand for their organs?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of questions there, and it's honestly like, has to stop somehow, right?
And Levi, as our last 2 minutes here, I kind of, something that interesting you were talking to me about, which is what exactly happens when you neglect the calls of the people who say, we've been through this, and then how do we go from here?
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of times you hear people quote Martin Luther King, and justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And it sounds somewhat theoretical. It's a nice sentiment. But I think COVID-19 is illustrative in a very, very concrete way related to organ harvesting. This is an idea, I think, that was first expressed by one of the lead organ harvesting investigators, David Mattis. If we think about if we got real with forced organ harvesting, what would that really look like? We would have to have transparency into every single medical institution in China and know exactly what's going on. Maybe it's a person there, maybe somehow. If we had someone in the Wuhan hospital on the end of that night, what was December 29th, we would have known, okay, we've got a potentially dangerous virus here, and right away the United States and other countries would be able to take action. And it has a real, not having that transparency has been a real problem. And I think Taiwan is a test case that indicates that theory is true. They had transparency, they saw what was happening, they immediately shut down flights, and it's like they're on a different planet. They were out without the virus for a year and a half, and even today it's a very, very open place. So I think there are real ramifications for ignoring this kind of a bad actor on the world stage.
It's very interesting, as this issue will be ongoing until, I hope that next time we don't have to cover this as the persecution would end in China. But I want to thank you all for contributing and your amazing analysis today. So I want to thank our panelists, but also your us, the audience watching at home, for sticking with us for the hour and really pay attention to this issue. Now, our coverage will conclude now on the 2022 End Persecution Parade in Washington, D.C. I'm David Zhang, and take care. Have a wonderful day.